All right, so you sent this document over, and it really caught my eye.
Yeah.
This "What's Keeping India Poor" thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, it's a pretty fascinating read. I mean, it really dives deep.
Right into it.
Yeah. And you know what we're gonna do today is we're gonna kind of unpack this with you.
Okay.
Go through the main arguments and try to pinpoint those systemic roadblocks.
Yeah.
It identifies, the things that are really at the heart of this persistent poverty in India.
Absolutely. This is not just like a surface level look at it.
No.
This document gets really specific. It names 7 key areas where it sees these failures happening. So we've got corruption.
Yeah.
The state of education, infrastructure issues, land inequality,
Right.
the population pressures, the caste system, and then this really interesting phrase, economic strangulation,
Ooh.
which it blames on excessive red tape.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty direct.
It's a very direct analysis.
Direct is an understatement.
Uh-huh.
But here's the thing I appreciate about this document.
Yeah.
It doesn't just complain, right?
No, it doesn't just point fingers.
It actually lays out some solutions.
It does.
Pretty bold.
Bold ideas.
I suspect some pretty controversial solutions.
Potentially controversial.
So we're going to get into all of that today.
Okay, sounds good.
We're going to pull out the most important insights and some of the surprising facts that this document lays out.
All right.
Okay, so let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
And, we got to start with this issue of corruption.
Okay.
Because the document very clearly labels it the silent thief.
Yeah, and I think it makes a really strong case for why that is.
Mm-hmm.
It argues that even though the Indian government puts a lot of money into these welfare programs,
Right.
a huge chunk of that money just disappears.
Just gone.
Gone because of corruption. And the example they use is the public distribution system.
The PDS.
Yeah, or PDS for short.
Right.
Which is supposed to provide subsidized food
Right, to people who need it.
to the poorest people in India.
Yeah.
But get this, the World Bank estimates. And the document highlights this, that 40% of the grain
40%.
never actually reaches those people.
That's just mind-blowing.
It's a huge amount.
I mean, that's not just like a little inefficiency.
No.
That is a major drain on resources.
And the document is very clear about this. It's not just mismanagement.
Right.
It uses the word theft
Ooh, strong word.
to describe what's happening with these funds.
Okay, so what they're saying is, even if there's political will, even if there's the resources allocated, if the system itself is corrupt,
Right.
then it's almost like you're fighting an uphill battle.
You're pouring water into a leaky bucket.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to that core question that we always have.
The one that this document poses.
Yeah, why does poverty persist even when there are efforts being made to address it?
Right. And this analysis is saying, look, a huge part of it is that they help the resources.
They're just not getting where they need to go.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's corruption. That's the silent thief. Let's move on now to another really crucial area, and that is education.
Right.
And again, the document does not mince words.
Yep.
It calls India's education system a rickety mess.
It does, which is a pretty harsh assessment.
It is, but they back it up with some pretty compelling evidence.
They rely heavily on the ACER report,
The what?
the Annual Status of Education report, or
Right.
ACER for short,
Yes, sir, got it.
which has consistently shown that there are some pretty serious problems with the education system.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, one of the most startling things that they point out is that even by 5th grade,
5th grade.
yeah, a lot of students are struggling with basic reading and math.
Wow, so even by 5th grade, they haven't mastered those fundamental skills.
Yeah, it's pretty worrisome, and the document digs into the reasons behind this.
Okay, so what are they saying is causing this?
Well, they point to a few things. One is this emphasis on rote learning.
Rote learning.
So memorizing facts and figures without really understanding them.
Okay, so it's like memorization over comprehension.
Exactly. They also talk about outdated curriculums.
Right, because the world is changing. The economy is changing.
Right. The skills that people need are changing.
Yeah.
And the education system isn't keeping up.
So they're not prepared for the jobs of the future.
Right. And then there's the issue of ghost teachers.
Ghost teachers? What is that?
These are teachers who are on the payroll,
Okay.
but they don't actually show up to teach.
Wow, so they're getting paid, but they're not doing their job.
That's right. And this is particularly a problem in rural areas.
Right, where resources are already stretched thin.
Exactly.
So you've got this combination of factors.
Yeah, a really unfortunate combination.
And it's creating this situation where a lot of kids are just not getting the education they need.
And the document makes a really clear connection between this failing education system, and the cycle of poverty.
Yeah. Because if you don't have those basic skills,
Like literacy and numeracy.
it's going to be that much harder to get a good job.
Yeah, it makes it so much harder to break out of poverty.
It's like, education's supposed to be that ladder.
Right.
That helps you climb out of poverty.
But if that ladder's broken,
Yeah, if it's rickety, like they say.
then it's not going to do you much good.
Right. Okay, so we've got corruption, we've got education, 2 huge issues already.
Yeah, and we're not done yet.
Oh, no.
This document goes on to talk about infrastructure.
Infrastructure. Okay, so like roads, bridges, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And this is where they paint a really stark picture
Okay.
of the challenges facing rural India. They compare India to China.
Okay, interesting comparison.
Yeah, and they point out that China has had this massive economic transformation.
Right, everyone talks about China's economic growth.
Exactly. And a big part of that has been their investment in infrastructure.
Okay, so they built a lot of roads and bridges and power plants and all that.
Exactly. They made it easier for businesses to operate,
Right.
for goods to be transported, for people to travel.
Yeah, makes sense.
And in contrast, rural India is often lacking these basic things.
Oh, so they're saying that there are places in rural India that don't even have reliable electricity.
Right, or they have really bad roads that make it hard to transport goods.
So you can imagine how that would impact a farmer trying to get their crops to market.
Exactly, it makes it so much more difficult.
And they also mentioned limited internet access.
Yeah, in this day and age.
Right? Being connected is so crucial.
Absolutely, for education, for business, for just staying informed.
Yeah, it's like being cut off from the world.
It really is. And the document argues that this isolation keeps these communities trapped in poverty.
Okay, so they're saying that lack of infrastructure is a major factor in perpetuating poverty.
Exactly. It holds back economic growth.
Right.
It limits access to services.
Yeah,
And it really just makes it harder for people to improve their lives.
like a vicious cycle.
It really is.
Okay, so we've got corruption, education, infrastructure.
And there's more.
Buckle up, everybody.
All right, next up is land inequality.
Okay, and the document calls this a feudal hangover.
Yeah. Which I thought was an interesting way to put it.
It kind of hints at this really long history.
Yeah, this deep-rooted issue.
Okay, so what's the problem with land inequality?
Well, the document explains that in a lot of India, land ownership is very unevenly distributed.
Okay, so you've got a small group of people who own a lot of land,
Vast amounts of land.
and then you have a lot of people who own very little or no land at all.
Exactly. And that creates a huge problem.
Because if you don't own any land,
It's really hard to build wealth.
right, it's hard to grow your own food.
It's hard to get a loan.
It's hard to have any kind of security.
Right, you're stuck.
You're stuck. And the document mentions land reform as a possible solution.
Yeah, the idea of redistributing land from the wealthy landowners to the landless.
That sounds like a pretty radical solution.
It is. And the document acknowledges that it's a very politically sensitive issue.
I can imagine.
They even say it's a spicy one.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and they talk about how the political class is very reluctant to touch this issue.
It's like the third rail of Indian politics.
Exactly. So even though land reform could potentially have a huge impact on poverty.
It's very difficult to implement.
Yeah, because those in power benefit from the status quo.
Okay, so land inequality, another major obstacle.
Yeah, and now we get to another sensitive topic,
What's that?
population pressure.
Okay, too many mouths, as the document puts
Yeah, that's their phrasing.
it. So what are they saying about population growth in India?
Well, they point out that India has over 1.4 billion people.
That's a lot of people.
It's a huge population and it's still growing.
And what does that mean for poverty?
Well, it puts a strain on resources.
Right, like jobs, food, housing.
Exactly. There's only so much to go around.
And the document highlights a link between high population growth and poverty.
Yeah, they specifically mention states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar,
Okay.
which have both high poverty rates and high fertility rates.
Okay, so more people, less resources, more poverty.
It's a complex equation, but that's the basic idea.
But what's the solution?
Well, the document argues that population control has to be part of the conversation.
Okay, but that's a very loaded term, right?
It is very controversial.
Yeah, because who gets to decide how many children people have?
Right. And the document acknowledges this.
Okay.
They say that it needs to be done through education and incentives.
Okay, so not through coercion.
No, not forcing people.
But giving them the knowledge and the means to make their own choices.
Exactly. Educating girls about family planning.
Yeah.
Providing access to contraception.
Okay.
And maybe even offering some financial incentives for smaller families.
Okay, so it's a sensitive issue.
Very sensitive.
But one that the document argues needs to be addressed.
Yeah, they say it's crucial.
Okay, so we've talked about corruption, education, infrastructure, land inequality, population.
Yeah, and now we get to a topic that's deeply embedded in Indian society.
And that is
The caste system.
the caste system, yeah.
Which the document calls the invisible shackle.
Ooh, that's powerful imagery.
It is, and it really gets at the heart of the issue.
So what are they saying about the caste system?
Well, they argue that even in the 21st century,
Right.
the caste system is still a major barrier for millions of people.
So even though it's officially outlawed,
Yeah, it's still very much a reality for a lot of people.
especially for those at the bottom of the caste hierarchy.
Right, the Dalits and those in the lower castes.
Okay. And how does this caste system manifest itself?
Well, it can take many forms.
Okay.
Discrimination in education, discrimination in employment,
Yeah.
lack of social respect,
Right.
sometimes even violence.
So it really impacts every aspect of their lives.
It does, and the document talks about the policy of reservations,
Reservations.
which is a form of affirmative action.
Okay.
So it's designed to help those who have been historically disadvantaged
Right.
by reserving spots for them in education and government jobs.
Okay, so it's like giving them a leg up.
Exactly. But the document points out that while reservations have helped some people, they've also created some problems.
Oh, so what kind of problem?
Well, there's been some resentment from those who feel like they're being excluded.
Right, because they see it as reverse discrimination.
Exactly. And there's also been some inefficiencies in the system.
Okay, so it's a complex issue.
It is very complex.
And the document doesn't really offer a simple solution?
No, they suggest a potential shift towards supporting people based on their economic need.
Okay, so instead of focusing on caste,
Yeah,
you focus on poverty.
exactly. Help those who need it most, regardless of their caste.
Okay, that's an interesting idea.
It is, but the document acknowledges that it would be very controversial.
Yeah, I can see why.
It would be a huge change.
A huge change. Okay, so that's the caste system. And now we come to the final systemic failure that the document identifies.
All right, and this one is called economic strangulation, red tape hell.
Ooh, that sounds bureaucratic.
It is very much so.
Okay, so what is this red tape hell all about?
Well, it's basically about how excessive bureaucracy and regulations can stifle economic activity.
Okay, so too many rules, too much paperwork.
Exactly. And the document argues that this is a major problem in India.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard to start and run a business.
Okay, so if you want to be an entrepreneur, you've got to jump through all these hoops.
Got to get permits and licenses and approval.
And that can be very time-consuming and expensive.
Exactly. And it can discourage people from even trying.
Right, so it's like the system is working against you.
In a way, yes. And the document points out that this has a direct impact on poverty.
How so?
Well, if businesses can't grow, they can't create jobs.
Right, and if there are no jobs,
People stay poor.
so it's another one of those vicious cycles.
Exactly. And the document does acknowledge that India has made some progress in this area.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, they've improved their ranking in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index.
Okay, so that means it's getting easier to do business in India.
Yeah, but the document also says it's still a slog.
So there's still a long way to go.
Exactly. They argued that simplifying regulations,
Right, cutting the red tape.
yeah, could really unleash a lot of entrepreneurial energy.
Especially in smaller towns and rural areas.
Exactly where it's really needed.
Okay, so we've gone through all 7 systemic failures.
Yeah, a pretty comprehensive list.
I'd say so. And now comes the part I've been waiting for.
The solutions?
The solutions, yeah. The controversial fix, as the document calls it.
And they're not kidding about the controversial part.
Oh no, they're really putting it all out there.
They argue that no single solution is enough.
Okay.
It's going to take a combination of approaches.
A multi-pronged attack.
Exactly. And they lay out this really bold plan.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right. So first up, they propose tech-powered governance.
Ooh, that sounds futuristic.
The idea is to use technology,
Yeah.
specifically blockchain.
Blockchain, yeah, that's the thing with Bitcoin.
Yeah, but it can be used for so much more than just cryptocurrency.
Okay, so how would they use it to fight poverty?
Well, they propose using it to track every rupee spent on welfare programs.
So like the PDS that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Every transaction would be recorded on this tamper-proof digital ledger.
Okay, so it's like creating a transparent system.
Exactly. No more money disappearing into thin air.
Okay, I can see how that would be powerful.
Yeah, it could really help to ensure that aid reaches those who need it.
All right, so that's tech-powered governance.
Yeah. Next up is an education revolution.
Ooh, sounds dramatic.
It is. They're calling for a complete overhaul of the education system.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, they want to shift away from rote learning.
Yeah, we talked about that.
And instead focus on practical skills.
Skills that are actually in demand.
Exactly. Things like coding, vocational training, entrepreneurship.
The skills that will help people get jobs.
That's the goal. And they also want to invest in digital classrooms.
Okay, so bringing technology into the classroom.
Yes, and making sure that rural schools have the same resources as urban schools.
It's important.
It is. And they also talk about attracting and retaining high-quality teachers.
Yeah, because teachers are the backbone of the system.
Absolutely. And they even mentioned South Korea as an example.
Oh, South Korea. Yeah, they've had incredible economic growth.
They have. And a big part of that has been their focus on education.
So they're saying India could learn from South Korea's example?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the education revolution.
Yeah, then we have the infrastructure blitz.
Ooh, another military metaphor.
I know, right? They're really going all out.
Okay, so what's the blitz about?
Well, they're talking about a massive investment in infrastructure.
Okay, how massive?
They're suggesting something like $500 billion over a decade.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is, but they argue that it's necessary.
Okay, so where would this money go?
Well, they want to improve rural roads.
Okay.
Ensure reliable electricity supply.
Yeah, we talked about that.
And expand broadband internet access.
So basically connecting rural India to the rest of the country and to the world.
Exactly, and they believe that this will create jobs, boost economic growth.
Yeah, it's like laying the foundation for future prosperity.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the infrastructure blitz.
Yeah, and now we get to the really controversial stuff.
Oh boy.
Yeah, first up is land reform.
Oh yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, this is where they say, yes, we're going there.
I love their boldness.
I know, right? They're not shying away from tough topics.
So what are they proposing?
Well, they're actually advocating for redistributing land.
Okay, so taking land from the wealthy landowners.
And giving it to the landless.
Wow, that's a big step.
It is, and they even cite Taiwan as an example.
Taiwan? Okay, what happened in Taiwan?
Well, they had successful land reforms in the 1950s.
And did it help?
Yeah, it's credited with helping to reduce poverty and boost economic growth.
Okay, so they're saying India could follow Taiwan's lead.
Exactly. But, of course, they acknowledge that there would be a lot of resistance.
Yeah, from the people who stand to lose their land.
Exactly. But the document argues that addressing poverty has to be the priority.
Okay, so land reform, a controversial but potentially impactful solution.
Yes. And then we have another controversial one.
What's that?
Population pushback.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, they're really diving into the deep end here.
Okay, so what are they saying about population?
Well, they're basically suggesting a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
Expanding educational opportunities for girls.
Okay.
Ensuring access to family planning services.
Mm-hmm.
And implementing incentives for smaller families.
Like tax breaks or something.
Yeah, or even direct payments.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
It is, but they argue that it's necessary.
Because of the strain on resources.
Exactly. They specifically mention Uttar Pradesh.
That state with the high population density?
Yeah, they say it's a major factor in the poverty there.
Okay, so they're saying the population growth needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and they're proposing some pretty bold solutions.
Solutions that are bound to spark a lot of debate.
Definitely.
Okay, and the final solution in their plan is?
Economic liberation.
Economic liberation. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, it's basically about reducing government intervention in the economy.
Okay, so less regulation.
Exactly. They want to cut red tape, simplify the tax system.
Yeah, make it easier to do business.
Exactly. And they argue that this will unleash entrepreneurship, create jobs.
Boost economic growth.
Yeah. They believe that the private sector is the key to lifting people out of poverty.
Okay, so it's a very pro-market approach.
It is. And of course, it's not without its critics.
Right, because some people would argue that deregulation can lead to exploitation.
Exactly. But the document argues that the potential benefits outweigh the risks.
Okay, so that's their plan. A really ambitious really bold plan.
And potentially very controversial.
Yeah, I can see why people would be divided on this.
They acknowledge that there would be pushback.
But they also emphasize the potential payoff.
Yeah, millions escaping poverty.
A revitalized rural economy.
Reduced corruption.
Increased economic growth.
Yeah, a pretty compelling vision.
It is, and I think what really drives home the urgency of this is the data that they cite.
The data on poverty in India.
Yeah, they point out that India did make progress in reducing poverty.
Between 1993 and 2011.
Yeah.
But then came the COVID-19 pandemic.
And that really threw things off track.
It did, according to the Pew Research Center.
Yeah.
An estimated 75 million more people fell into poverty in 2020.
Wow, so all that progress was wiped out.
Pretty much, and that's why they're arguing that incremental change is not enough.
Right. We need bold action.
Exactly.
Okay, so this document is really a call to action.
It is. It's a challenge to the status quo.
And it ends with this really thought-provoking question.
Yeah, a question for the reader.
And now a question for you, our listener. After laying out all these problems, these potential solutions,
Yeah.
they ask, is this the radical shakeup that India needs?
Or are there other perspectives that we need to consider?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, there are so many factors at play,
So many stakeholders.
and any solution is going to have trade-offs.
Right. There's no magic bullet.
No, but I think this document does a really good job of laying out the challenges,
Yeah. It really makes you think.
and it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and ultimately it's up to each individual
Right.
to decide what they believe is the best way forward.
But we can't ignore these issues.
No, we can't just pretend they don't exist.
And we have to be willing to have these difficult conversations.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sending us this document.
Yeah, it's been a really stimulating discussion.
It has, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, we hope you found it informative.
And we hope it inspires you to learn more about these issues.
And to engage in these conversations.
Because the more we understand these challenges,
The better equipped we are to find solutions.
and to create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for today.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.